Hello folks. Today I'm going to talk about and compare an assortment of cameras from the perspective of using them to make YouTube videos, particularly for someone just starting out or working on a tight budget. Everyone's individual needs and use case varies wildly, so I understand that not all of these options will be practical for every use case. But with that in mind, I did try to include a variety of camera types. Budgets vary as much as anything else, so cheap is relative. And obviously, some of these cameras here aren't what most people would call cheap, but I think each one represents a viable option at a particular price level. These cameras are just examples of what's out there and not exclusive recommendations. There are tons of options these days, and I simply think that these cameras represent a wide range of what's out there. So far, I've been recording with a Sony AX53 camcorder, but I will be switching between the cameras that are on the table during this part of the video, and I will put what camera and audio setup that I'm using up in the top left corner. First up is a Kodak Zi8, which I bought on eBay for $20. It is nearly 10 years old at this point, so beware there is some risk to buying a camera that old. The lens on mine was really nasty. It cleaned up okay, but it's still not perfect. This camera records at 1080p resolution, but it also does 1280 by 720 resolution at up to 60 frames per second. It also has digital image stabilization. It doesn't work great, but it's better than nothing. There is a lot of rolling shutter in 1080p, but 720p is much better both in 60 and 30 frames per second. It only has digital zoom, and it's fairly slow and limited. Being an older camera, it won't recognize large capacity SD cards. I tried a 32 gigabyte card and it did not recognize it, but an older 8 gig card I have works fine. It does have a macro and standard setting for the lens, but the focus is otherwise fixed. Standard mode seems to have a minimum focus distance of around 3 feet, which is a limitation if you're recording like I am now at a desk with the camera pretty close to the desk. And you'll see that limitation in a moment when I switch to this camera. The macro setting has a focus distance of only a couple inches from the lens, so it does allow you to get some really nice detailed close-ups, but that's pretty much all that the macro setting is useful for. Unfortunately, it doesn't let you focus within about 2 or 3 feet. The main thing which stands out on this camera, especially for the price, is the fact that it has a microphone input jack. It is slightly recessed, so some cables and microphones they don't seat super well, but even still, it's really nice to have, and it's a great feature at this price. The audio quality isn't amazing in general, but it's certainly not bad. Overall, this camera is far from perfect, and the minimum focus distance is a bummer. But if you want the cheapest thing you can get to make videos, you can certainly do much worse for 20 bucks. The next camera is 11 years old, so we're going back even further with this one. This is the Canon Vixia HF20 camcorder that I purchased new many years ago. I've seen them available around $100 recently, so it could be a decent option. This was a relatively expensive model back in its day, so it does have a lot of features, but there are some drawbacks due to its age. Like the Kodak, it won't recognize high-capacity SD cards. However, this particular model has 32 gigabytes of internal memory, so that is a plus. The camera records at up to 1080 60 frames per second, but it is 1080i, so it's interlaced footage. However, it also has 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second. It has a good quality lens with 15x optical zoom and image stabilization. The stabilization is okay, but it's not as good as newer camcorders. Autofocus is nothing special, but it is adequate. The image quality suffers a bit due to the older sensor, older processing, and interlaced footage, but it does okay for $100. It also has lots of manual control options, a microphone input jack, a headphone jack. It has HDMI output with an optional clean output or an output with the display that you would get on the screen. It has face detection mode and a pre-record option, and it just really is loaded with features. It's a far from perfect camera, but it is very feature rich for $100. Next up is the Fuji XP130. This camera was around $110 last I saw, but it has since been discontinued. It may be difficult to find this exact model, but at least it will give you some idea of what you can expect from a camera like this. It records at up to 1080p 60 frames per second, but it also has 120 frames per second at 640 by 480 and 240 frames per second at 320 by 240. Now those are really low resolutions, but it can still be kind of fun to play around with. It has optical image stabilization and 5x optical zoom. It doesn't have the best autofocus, particularly when zooming in or out, and it doesn't have a mic jack though. Still, for around $100, the image quality is decent. It's also water resistant and it's simple to use. It can focus very close, and it's a modern camera, so it works with large capacity SD cards. I do really wish it had some way to cover or protect the lens. It doesn't include any kind of cap or anything, so you have to be careful that it doesn't get scratched up. Seems like a bit of an oversight for a camera that is supposed to be kind of a rugged travel camera. Next up we have another camcorder. This is the Sony CX405. It is generally priced around $200, so it is a big step up in price from the previous camera, but it is a current model camcorder. It takes micro SD cards, and it will work with very large capacity cards. It doesn't have an external microphone input, and the Canon HF20 actually has a few more features and a bit higher quality lens. This camera has very minimal buttons and controls. It just has a little joystick on the flip-out display that does pretty much everything. It doesn't have the greatest image detail or low light performance due to a very small sensor, but it is still a good little camera. It has good color, it has better image stabilization than anything we've looked at so far, it has 30x optical zoom, it can record at 1080p 60 frames per second, it has decent though not perfect autofocus, and it can focus very close. It is a very simple camera to use, and while it initially feels a bit light and cheap, it is very small and light, and kind of the smooth, streamlined shape when it's closed up makes it great for slipping in a large pocket or something like that. Next up is the Canon SX530 HS. This is another camera that seems to have been discontinued quite recently, but the last I saw it, it was $200. Overall for video, I'd say that the CX405 does beat this camera. This camera doesn't have quite as good of image stabilization or autofocus, it has far fewer manual controls and recording modes, and it doesn't have an articulating screen. But what this camera does have is 50x optical zoom. It also takes far better pictures than any camera we've looked at so far, so if photos are important to you, that's something to consider. In addition to the long zoom, it can focus so close that the subject can be all but touching the lens. The zoom mechanism is rather noisy and it gets picked up in the audio, which does make it all the more a shame that this does not have an external microphone jack. So overall, far from perfect, but it can record at 1080p 30 frames per second with 50x zoom. Next up is the Canon M6. This camera is also discontinued. I'm sensing a bit of a trend here. Unfortunately, it seems like just many of these cameras have recently become unavailable. So if you can't find these specific cameras, just keep in mind that the key is to keep an eye out for good, older models that are being discontinued. Often the deepest discounts are due to inventory clear out before a model is discontinued. I'm sure that's why I found deals on some of these cameras. New stuff is released all the time, which means that yesterday's latest and greatest is today's discounted model. Shortly before the M6 was discounted, I got this one for $350 brand new with the kit lens. The lens on here now is not the kit lens, but the kit lens has optical stabilization and the camera has digital stabilization as well. And this is a mirrorless camera with an APS-C sized sensor, so it will have better low light performance and a much shallower possible depth of field than anything else here on the desk. It records at 1080p, it has Canon's dual pixel autofocus, and it has a mic jack. And if photos are important to you, it obviously takes the best photos out of anything we'll be looking at today. It isn't perfect. The 1080p video isn't a very high bitrate, and it isn't super detailed. The image stabilization is okay, but it certainly won't beat the camcorders here. It still does go to show that you can get a lot of camera for your money if you are willing to keep an eye out for discounts and are okay with a slightly older model. Next is the Panasonic FZ300. This camera has been around for about 5 years, but it is still currently available. It is relatively expensive at $400, but you get a lot of functionality for that price. It has a microphone jack, it has 24x optical zoom with optical image stabilization, and it has a constant aperture of f2.8 throughout the zoom range. It can record at 4K, it has an articulating screen, and it is weather resistant. Now, it's not perfect. The autofocus can be a bit slow at times, and it is quite a large camera for what it is. The image stabilization is pretty good, but it can get weird sometimes, especially if you have the camera resting against something, and it will sometimes get kind of fluttery and doesn't really know what to do. It's okay, but it doesn't match the stabilization on most modern camcorders. Overall, a camera like this certainly won't be for everyone, and $400 is no small amount of money, but it is an attractive package with good specs for the price. Lastly, I have a camcorder that really doesn't fit in this comparison. This is the Sony AX53, and it generally goes for around $850. Retail price is $1,000, but over the last couple of years, it has spent far more time at $850 than it has at $1,000. Even still, that is a massive jump in price compared to the other cameras here. So this is not a budget camera by any stretch, but it does provide a lot of features for the money, and I thought I'd include it as an interesting point of comparison. The AX53 is a bit lacking in terms of full manual control, but otherwise it is a very full-featured camcorder with good quality 4K, excellent stabilization, 20x zoom, relatively high bitrate recording options. It has infrared night shot, it has a microphone jack, a headphone jack, and a viewfinder. It also has Sony's internal gimbal setup. So essentially, the entire lens and sensor assembly is on an internal gimbal. And obviously, it doesn't have the movement range of a standard gimbal, but it can still provide impressive stabilization in a lot of situations. So that's just a bit about all these cameras, and you've seen how each one does at my desk under cheap LED lighting. So let's see how they do in a few more situations. First, I have some close-up clips from each camera. All of these cameras do pretty good up close. The Kodak Zi8 requires a physical switch into macro mode, and it remains a fixed focus at that point, but it does get detailed video. The weak image stabilization hurts it a bit. The 11-year-old Canon looks great. It doesn't focus as close as the others, but it is still very good. The Fuji took a couple attempts to get the focus to lock on to what I want, but then it did well. The Sony CX405 focuses super close and can get some really close-up shots. The Canon SX530 also focuses super close, and the autofocus works almost as well as the CX405 at those close distances. The Canon M6 close focus will vary with the lens, as will the background blur. Here I'm using the 22mm f2, and it's providing a very shallow depth of field and reasonably close focus. The Panasonic FZ300 wouldn't focus quite as close as some of the others, but it does okay. Again, the AX53 is just here for the heck of it. It does focus pretty close, about as close as the FZ300. So I'm going to stop talking for a bit and let you hear the ambient sounds that were recorded with the built-in mics from each camera in a different outdoor scene. All did okay in terms of outdoor audio. The SX530 seemed to pick up a lot more wind noise, but that may have just been bad luck with the wind or the mic position. To demonstrate stabilization, I did a slow, careful walk, as well as one clip with me just walking normally with the camera held out in front of me, and I did this with each camera. As you can see, the stabilization of the Zi8 isn't very good. It mostly helps reduce small jitters when standing still, but it doesn't do well when moving around. I also don't have the steadiest hands. The Canon HF20 does okay, but it's clear that the cameras have come a long way in the last 11 years. It definitely smooths out a lot of the small jitters, but it leaves in a lot of the larger, jerky movements, particularly when walking normally. Exposure and color were consistently very good on the HF20. The Fuji XP130 did surprisingly well in terms of image stabilization for a small point and shoot, but the color and exposure were a little disappointing. It tends a little dark and very green. It wasn't difficult to make some corrections and get it looking a lot more natural, but the out-of-camera performance wasn't impressive. Honestly, even the Zi8 did a much better job in terms of color and exposure outside. The Sony CX405 has very good stabilization. It's not perfect, but it did a very good job, even when walking normally. Overall, the color and exposure is very good. It sometimes tends a little bit green, but overall, quite good. The Canon SX530 also did a very good job at stabilization, particularly surprising when walking normally. Did very well. It sways a bit, but it's a natural-looking movement. Stabilization struggles a little bit when fully zoomed in, but 50x optical zoom is a lot to stabilize. Color and exposure were okay, but leaned just a tiny bit warm at times. Keep in mind, all but the Kodak have adjustable white balance, so these remarks about color apply to the auto white balance, which is what I used. The Canon M6 struggles a bit when it comes to stabilization, but remember, I'm only using digital stabilization here, so it did better than I expected. Color was very good. The Panasonic FZ300 stabilization did very well. Color and exposure was very good, but like the SX530, it sometimes looked a bit warmer than natural. The Sony AX53 has a smoothness that makes it almost look like slow motion at times. It definitely has the best stabilization in handheld situations, but it did get jittery sometimes on the tripod, so it should probably be either switched to a different mode or even just switched off when using a tripod. Color and exposure were very accurate, if not always the most pleasing. Overall, I think each of these cameras has something to offer, and maybe these examples will give you an idea of the kind of results you can expect from a variety of camera types at a variety of price levels. This wasn't an in-depth look at any particular camera here, but hopefully it shows that even a $20 10-year-old camera can be used to get decent results in certain situations. The main point is there are options out there for almost every budget. So if you have any questions or if you'd like a detailed review of any of these cameras, let me know. And as always, thank you for watching. Take care.